The morning I found out, I was standing in my kitchen in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, wearing a robe that had a small coffee stain on the left sleeve that I never got around to washing out. The refrigerator was humming. There was a half eaten piece of toast on the counter, and on my phone, a bank notification, a balance alert, $312,000, gone, not stolen by a stranger, not taken by some faceless scammer on the internet, taken by the two people I raised, my daughter, my son. And the worst part, by the time I saw that number on my phone, by the time the refrigerator hum and the cold linoleum floor and that stupid coffee stain all became the backdrop to the worst moment of my life, they had already been doing it for 2 years. 2 years. My name is Dorothy. I am 68 years old. I am a widow, and this is the story of how my own children tried to erase me, and how a quiet, unremarkable accountant named Gerald made sure they could not. Let me tell you who I was before any of this, not who I thought I was, who I actually was. I grew up outside of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the kind of place where people do not talk about money and they do not talk about feelings, and they especially do not talk about the two of them at the same time. My father worked in a machine shop for 31 years. My mother kept the books at a small hardware store until she could not see well enough to do it anymore. They were not cold people. They were just people who showed love by staying, by not leaving, by being there when the furnace broke and when the car would not start and when you needed someone to sit next to you without saying a single word. I married Robert when I was 23. He was 26. He sold agricultural equipment for a mid-sized company out of York, and he was good at it, not because he was flashy or charming in that car salesman way, but because he was genuinely, almost stubbornly honest. Farmers liked him. He would drive 2 hours to deliver a part himself, rather than make someone wait a week for shipping. He was the kind of man who wrote thank you notes by hand and meant every word. We were not rich. I want to be clear about that. We were not rich in the way my children would later decide we were in their heads. We were careful. We were patient. We clipped coupons until we could stop clipping them. We bought a house in a good school district and paid it off over 20 years. We put money into CDs and bonds and Robert's 401k like it was a religion, not because anyone told us to, because we had both watched our parents struggle, and we decided, quietly, the way people from Lancaster decide things, that we were not going to do that. By the time Robert retired at 62, we had built something real. A house worth around $240,000 paid in full, a combined retirement account sitting just above $400,000, a brokerage account that I had quietly grown over 20 years of careful, boring, sensible investments, government bonds, index funds, nothing exciting, nothing clever, just time and discipline. Robert died 18 months after he retired, pancreatic cancer, fast and brutal and completely without fairness. 4 months from diagnosis to the end. He was 63 years old. He had just started learning to make bread. There was still flour on the kitchen counter the morning we came home from the hospital for the last time. I left it there for 3 days before I wiped it off. I do not know why. I just could not bring myself to do it. Grief, I have learned, does not come in stages the way the books say it does. It comes in flour on a counter. It comes in a coffee mug in the wrong cabinet. It comes in a phone ringing and your hand reaching for it because your body still expects a voice that is not coming. I was 64 years old. I had never lived alone in my life. And I had, after the estate settled, after the life insurance, after everything, roughly $780,000 to my name, a number that sounds large, a number that felt like a target. I have 2 children. My daughter Renee is 43. My son Craig is 40. I want to be fair to them. I want to tell you who they were before I tell you what they did. Because if I start with what they did, you will picture 2 cartoon villains, and it was never that simple. It is never that simple. Renee was the child who read every book in the school library by the time she was 12. She was brilliant in the way that made teachers nervous, always one step ahead, always asking the question no one had thought to ask yet. She went to Penn State on a partial scholarship, graduated with a degree in finance, and spent her 20s in Philadelphia working at a mid-size investment advisory firm. She married a man named Todd who worked in commercial real estate. They had 2 children, a house in the mainline suburbs, and a lifestyle that cost significantly more than it produced. I knew about the credit card debt. She told me, not all of it, but enough. I lent her $15,000 in 2019 to help them catch up. She paid back 9 of it. We never discussed the other 6. I let it go. Because that is what you do. Craig is my younger one, softer than Renee. Always was. He moved to Charlotte, North Carolina in his late 20s, opened a specialty landscaping business with a partner, and for a while it was going well. Then the partnership dissolved badly. There was a lawsuit, money owed on both sides, nothing that ever fully resolved. He called me more after that, more often, for longer.
I was glad he called. I want you to understand that. I was glad. Because here is my flaw. Here is the thing I carried into all of this without seeing it clearly. I am a fixer. I am the woman who stayed up until 2 a.m. helping Craig rewrite his business plan when he was 28.
I am the woman who wired money to Renee's checking account with 2 words of explanation and 0 expectation of a conversation. I showed love by solving, by removing the friction, by making the difficulty go away. And somewhere along the way, I cannot tell you exactly when, because it did not happen in a single moment, my 2 children stopped seeing that as love. They started seeing it as access. If you have ever been in a family where your generosity became an expectation, where your sacrifice became an assumption, I need you to hit that like button right now, because I know you understand exactly what I mean, and I know you know how quietly it happens, how you do not notice until it is already done. After Robert died, both Renee and Craig came home for the funeral and stayed for a week. They were attentive and kind, and I was grateful. They helped me sort through his clothes. They sat with me at the kitchen table and looked at old photos. Renee organized the paperwork from the hospital. Craig drove me to the lawyer to go over the will. That was the first time the conversation happened. Not a suspicious conversation. Not a manipulative one, at least not in a way I could name at the time. It was just Craig, sitting across from me at that same kitchen table, the evening after the lawyer meeting, saying, "Mom, you should really think about who is managing all this for you. Dad handled everything, right? You do not want to be dealing with it alone." He was right. Robert had managed the finances, not because I was incapable. I had worked as an office administrator for 22 years. I could read a spreadsheet, but because we had divided responsibilities in that quiet, unspoken way that marriages do over decades. He handled investments, I handled the house, the kids' schedules, the insurance, the doctors. So yes, Craig was right. I should have someone helping me. What I did not understand, sitting at that table with my grief still raw and the house still smelling faintly of the flowers from the service, was that Craig was not suggesting someone neutral. He was suggesting himself. Over the next 3 months, in careful, gentle, never pushy increments, Craig offered to help me manage things. He would look over the statements. He would make sure the bills were organized.
He was in Charlotte, yes. But everything was online now. He would call me every Sunday. He would walk me through anything I did not understand. And I said yes, because he was my son.
Because I was alone, because the refrigerator was still humming and Robert was still not there. That is the honest reason. Not because I was stupid, because I was lonely. The loneliness of widowhood is not something that gets discussed honestly enough. It is not the big dramatic moments of loss. It is the Tuesday afternoons. It is having a thought and turning to tell someone and there being no one to turn to. It is the accumulation of small silences until you will do almost anything to replace them with a voice, even one you should be questioning more carefully. By the end of that first year, Craig had access to my primary checking account. I had added him as a joint account holder. He had the login information for my investment brokerage because I had given it to him so he could check on things and make sure the automatic transfers were running right. And Renee, who had called me more frequently than she had in years, had started a new conversation, a thoughtful one, about estate planning. "Mom," she said one Sunday in October, "you should really think about a trust. For tax purposes, for protecting what you have built. I can help you find the right attorney." She was not wrong about trusts. Trusts are a completely reasonable estate planning tool. I want to be clear about that. What she said was technically accurate. What she did not tell me was that the attorney she had in mind was a college friend of Todd's who had a very particular kind of practice, the kind where a significant portion of the assets placed in trust became, with the right language buried in the right clause, accessible to the named trustees during the grantor's lifetime. And who did Renee suggest as trustees? Herself and Craig. I want you to sit with that for a second, because this is where I need you to understand something important. I was not a naive woman. I had 64 years of life behind me. I had raised these two people. I had watched them make mistakes and recover from them and make new ones. I thought I knew them. What I did not know, what none of us ever wants to know about the people we love, is what they are capable of when they are scared and in debt, and when they have decided that what you have is already theirs in some future, that they have simply decided to move up. The trust documents were signed in January, 14 months after Robert died. I remember the morning clearly. Gray January light coming through the blinds in the attorney's office, a small conference room that smelled like carpet cleaner and stale air. The attorney, a man named Warren, mid-50s, pleasant enough, walked me through the documents in what I now understand was a very deliberate way. He answered every question I asked. He just did not ask me the questions I should have been asking myself. Renee sat to my left. Craig had called in on speakerphone from Charlotte. They were both warm, encouraging, patient. I signed, and for the next 14 months, I had no idea what was happening to my money. Actually, that is not entirely true. I had a feeling, that low-frequency, background noise kind of feeling that you learn to dismiss because it is easier than confronting what it might mean. The kind of feeling that shows up in small things, in a statement that does not look quite right, in a question that gets answered just a little too quickly, in a phone call that ends just a little too soon. I noticed, I always noticed. I just chose not to see it, because when you love someone, truly love them, you choose to be blind for as long as you possibly can. You hold on to the version of them that you built in your heart. The child who called you from a payphone at a college party just to say they got there safe. The daughter who sat at the foot of your hospital bed when you had your gallbladder out and held your hand without saying a word. You hold on to that, long past when you should have let go. Until one morning you are standing in your kitchen in a stained robe and the refrigerator is humming and your phone tells you a number you cannot explain, and the version of them you have been protecting finally cracks. In part 2, we are going to talk about what I found when I started looking, not what I suspected, what I found, the spreadsheets, the transfers, the timeline, and the man who helped me build a case so clean and so complete that by the time my children understood what was coming, there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. But before we get there, I need to ask you something, and I mean this sincerely. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you gave them access to something that was yours, and then realized, too late, that you had handed them the tools of your own undoing? If you have, I think you know exactly why I am telling this story. And if you know someone else who needs to hear it, please send this to them, not because of what I lost, because of what they might still be able to protect. I want to tell you exactly how it started, not with a dramatic moment, not with a phone call or a confrontation or a document left open on someone's screen. It started with a number that was $1,100 smaller than it should have been. That is it. That is the whole beginning of the story. $1,100. It was a Tuesday in March, 16 months after I had signed the trust documents. I was sitting at my kitchen table going through my mail, which I still did by hand because Robert always said you catch things on paper that you miss on a screen. And there was the quarterly statement from my brokerage, The one I had stopped reviewing as carefully because Craig had told me he was watching it, that it was fine, that I did not need to worry about the details. But I looked, out of habit, out of the small, stubborn part of me that my father had planted there decades ago, the part that said, "You always check, Dorothy. You always check." And I saw a line item for a transfer out, $1,140, dated 3 weeks prior, labeled simply Administrative Fee, Trust Management. I did not panic. I did not even feel suspicious, not immediately. I just felt confused because I did not remember agreeing to a trust management fee. I did not remember that being part of the conversation in Warren's office. So I called Craig, and Craig, in the warm, patient, slightly distracted voice he used when he was managing me, said, "Oh, Mom, yeah, that is just the standard administrative cost. It comes out quarterly. It is in the documents, I think around page 9 or 10. Warren's office handles it automatically. Do not worry about it. Do not worry about it." I wrote the phrase down in my notepad. I do not know why. I just did. Then I went and found the trust documents in the blue folder I had kept in the second drawer of Robert's old filing cabinet. I sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold while I read, and I read every page, including page 9, including page 10. There was no mention of a quarterly administrative fee. I went back 3 more quarters in my records. The fee had appeared before, I had just never noticed it, or I had seen it and dismissed it, the way you dismiss something when someone you love has told you not to worry. I found 4 of them, each between $900 and $1,300, different amounts each time, which I would later understand was deliberate, just varied enough to look like fluctuating costs, just small enough to stay below what people notice, approximately $4,300, gone. I sat with that for 3 days before I did anything else. 3 days of cooking dinner and watching television and going to my Tuesday water aerobics class at the IMCA and telling absolutely no one. Because I needed to be certain, because I was not going to accuse my children of something I could not prove, and because I knew, with a clarity that surprised me, that the moment they knew I was looking, everything would change. So I looked quietly. The way you learn to look when you have raised children who know how to read your face. I need to tell you about Gerald Kowalski. Gerald was 61 years old. He had been doing taxes and financial reviews for individuals and small businesses in the Harrisburg area for 28 years out of a 2-room office on Dairy Street above a dry cleaning shop. He drove a 10-year-old Buick. He wore short-sleeved dress shirts in colors that had no business existing, mustard yellow, a grain that I can only describe as aggressively optimistic. He kept a ceramic mug on his desk that said "World's Most OK Accountant," which his daughter had given him as a joke gift, and which he displayed without irony. Robert had used Gerald for years, not for anything complicated, just annual tax returns, some investment tracking, the kind of steady, reliable work that never requires brilliance but always requires precision. After Robert died, Gerald had sent a handwritten card, one of maybe 6 people outside our immediate circle who did. I had kept it. I called him on a Thursday morning in late April. I told him I needed him to look at something. I did not tell him what. I just said, "Gerald, I need a second set of eyes on my financial accounts, and I need someone who will not tell anyone I am asking." He said, "Dorothy, come in Friday at 2 o'clock. Bring everything you have. No alarm, no drama, just come in Friday." I brought 2 years of bank statements, the brokerage statements, the trust documents, and a notepad where I had written down every transfer I could not explain. I spread them across his desk and I watched his face. Gerald has one of those faces that does not give much away. Decades of sitting across from people in financial distress will do that to you. He just looked. He made notes. He asked questions in a quiet, methodical way that felt less like an interrogation and more like a man assembling a piece of furniture, steady, unhurried, checking every joint. We were there for 2 hours and 40 minutes. At the end of it, Gerald took off his glasses, set them on top of my notepad, and said, "Dorothy, I am going to need you to give me 2 weeks." and I am going to need you to not contact Craig or Renee about any of this. Not a word. Can you do that? I said, what did you find? He said, I found enough to know I need to look harder. That is the sentence I think about. That sentence, because it was not reassuring. Not in the way you want reassurance when you are sitting in a mustard yellow shirt accountant's office on a Friday afternoon hoping you are wrong about your own children. It was the opposite of reassurance. It was confirmation that the small, cold thing that had been sitting in my chest for 3 months had a name and a shape and a paper trail. I drove home. I made dinner. I watched the news. I did not sleep much, and I did not call Craig or Renee. 2 weeks became 3. 3 became almost 5. I did not push. Gerald called me twice with brief updates. He needed access to 2 more years of records. Could I request them from the brokerage directly? He needed a copy of the original trust filing with the county. He needed the attorney's full name and bar number. I got him everything he asked for. I learned how to request financial records I had never asked for before. I sat on hold with phone lines I did not know existed. I drove to the county recorder's office on a Wednesday morning and waited 40 minutes in a plastic chair next to a man filing a property dispute and came out with a certified copy of my own trust document. That part, the waiting in line, the hold music, the $3 copying fees, that part nobody tells you about. Nobody makes a documentary about the Tuesday afternoon you spend on hold with a brokerage's compliance department, but that is where cases like mine are actually built. In the boring, relentless, unsexy accumulation of paper, Gerald's findings, when he finally sat me down again, covered 11 pages of single-space notes. I am going to give you the summary because the full version would take the rest of the day. The fabricated administrative fees totaled $6,800 over 22 months. Small enough individually to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts, varied in amount to appear as fluctuating costs, deposited each time into a business account registered to a sole proprietorship Craig had opened in North Carolina, not his landscaping business, a separate LLC, one I had never heard of, created 4 months after I signed the trust. The larger transfers were the ones that took Gerald longer to trace. There had been 7 of them over 18 months. They ranged from $12,000 to $41,000. Each one had been authorized through the brokerage's online portal using my login credentials I had given Craig, remember, so he could check on things. Each transfer had gone to a joint account that Renee and Craig held together at a regional bank in Philadelphia, an account in both their names. Something they had opened, Gerald confirmed, approximately 6 weeks after the trust was signed. 6 weeks. They had opened a joint account 6 weeks after I signed. They had planned this together. Whatever story I had been telling myself about Craig being impulsive and Renee maybe not knowing the full picture, that story ended there. 6 weeks. They had gone home from that attorney's office and they had planned. Total confirmed transfers out of my accounts, $218,000. Gerald also found something else, something I had not asked him to look for. The attorney, Warren. Gerald had pulled his bar record. There were 2 prior complaints filed against him in the last 6 years, both involving estate planning documents where trustee authority had been written with unusually broad language. Both complaints had been dismissed. Both complainants, Gerald had managed to determine through court records, had settled privately. Warren was not Craig and Renee's accomplice by accident. He was, Gerald believed, a man who knew exactly what kind of documents he was writing. A man who had done this before. I sat in Gerald's office for a long time after he finished going through it with me. The dry cleaner downstairs was running. I could hear the faint mechanical rhythm through the floor. Gerald made us both coffee from a small machine on the bookshelf behind his desk. He did not say anything while I processed. He just let me sit there. And then, when I finally looked up, he said, "Dorothy, I want to be honest with you. What I have here is very solid, but what you do with it, that is your decision, not mine." He meant it. I could see that he meant it. He was not pushing me toward a particular outcome. He understood that the people who had done this were my children. He understood that this was not a simple decision. I looked at those 11 pages, $218,000, 2 years. A joint account opened 6 weeks after I signed. I thought about Robert's flour on the counter. I thought about the $9,000 Renee never paid back. I thought about the Sunday phone calls from Craig, how warm they had been, how consistent, how carefully engineered. And I told Gerald, I want to do this right. I want every single piece of evidence documented. I want this to be airtight. And then I want to know every option I have. Gerald nodded, picked up his pen, said, all right, let us talk about what comes next. During those 5 weeks that Gerald was working, I had to keep being a normal mother. Craig called on Sundays. I answered. We talked about his landscaping business, about the weather in Charlotte, about whether I had gotten my spring garden started yet. He was warm. Funny, even. He asked about my water aerobics class. He said, Mom, you should really look into that Mediterranean diet. There was an article, and I said, Craig, I have been eating fine for 68 years. I think I can manage. And we laughed. We laughed. I do not know how to explain what that is like. To laugh on the phone with your son while you have 11 pages of documented fraud sitting in a folder in your bedroom. To say I love you, talk soon, and mean the love, while simultaneously building a case against the person you are saying it to. I have thought about that a lot since. What it says about me that I could do it, whether it makes me calculating or just self-protective. I think it makes me human. I think it makes me a 68-year-old woman who had already lost the most important person in her life and was not ready to publicly lose two more until she had no other choice. Renee called twice during those weeks. Once to ask if I had thought any more about potentially downsizing the house, just as something to consider. Mom, not pressure, just thinking about what makes sense long term. The second time to mention that Todd's firm was doing well and that they were probably going to do some renovations, and she was so excited. Renovations. With my money, I said, that sounds lovely, Renee. And I got off the phone and I sat in Robert's armchair, the brown leather one by the window that I have never been able to replace, and I stared at the wall for a while. Here's what I want to say to anyone who is in the middle of something like this and has not yet reached the other side. The hardest part is not the anger. Anger, when it finally comes, is almost a relief. The hardest part is the grief inside the anger. The grief for the version of your children that you realize slowly, like a photograph developing in reverse, was always partially your own invention, the version you needed them to be, the version that let you sleep at night. That grief does not go away cleanly, even after everything that happened, even after what I am about to tell you in part 3. It just becomes something you carry differently. Be honest with me, and I am genuinely asking this. If you had found out what I found out, sitting in that accountant's office with 11 pages in your hands, would you have gone forward, or would you have found a way to justify letting it go? I think about that question. I think a lot of people facing their own children would have found a way to make it smaller, to call it a misunderstanding, to protect the relationship at the cost of themselves. I almost did. I want to be honest about that. I almost did. Gerald connected me with an attorney named Patricia Osei. She was a civil litigation specialist out of Harrisburg who had handled elder financial abuse cases for 16 years. She was direct in a way that I immediately respected, not unkind but not gentle either. The first thing she said when I sat down in her office was, "Tell me what happened, and do not leave anything out, including the parts that make you look foolish. I cannot help you if you protect your own ego." I liked her immediately. She reviewed Gerald's documentation over 4 days. She called me on a Wednesday evening, and I remember I was chopping onions for soup when the phone rang and I answered with my hands still damp, and she said, "Dorothy, this case is solid. Here's what I think we should do." What she described was not a family conversation. It was not a mediated sit down. It was not a letter asking for the money back with an implied threat. It was a coordinated legal action involving civil fraud claims, trustee breach of fiduciary duty, a formal complaint to the Pennsylvania State Bar regarding Warren, and a simultaneous petition to the court to dissolve the trust and restore direct control of my assets to me. Renee and Craig would receive notice on the same day, at the same time, before either of them could call the other. Patricia called it a clean serve. She had done it dozens of times. She knew exactly how it worked. She knew what people did when the papers arrived, who panicked, who called their own lawyers, who called their parents. She knew what Craig and Renee would do. She was right about all of it. In part 3, I am going to tell you about the morning the papers were served. I am going to tell you about the phone calls I received and the ones I did not.
I am going to tell you about what happened to Warren. And I am going to tell you how a widow from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, who signed the wrong documents on a gray January morning, got back what was hers. Most of it anyway. Some things you do not get back. But we will get to that.
If this story is hitting close to home, if you know an older parent, a widow, a relative who has handed access to someone they should not have, please share this, not for me, for them, because the people this happens to are not naive. They are not careless. They are just people who loved too openly and checked too rarely, and it happens every single day. The papers were served on a Wednesday morning in the second week of October. Patricia had chosen the day deliberately, not a Monday. People are already on edge on Mondays, already braced for things to go wrong. Wednesday, she said, is the day people are most settled into the week, most comfortable, most off guard. I did not know the exact hour it would happen. Patricia had not told me, and I had not asked, because I understood instinctively that knowing would have made those hours unbearable. So I did what I had been doing for 2 months. I made coffee, I went to water aerobics, I came home, I made a sandwich. At 12:47 in the afternoon, my phone rang. It was Craig. I did not answer. 14 minutes later, it rang again. Renee. I did not answer. I sat in Robert's armchair by the window, and I watched the oak tree in the front yard, the one Robert had planted as a sapling the year we moved in, the one that was now taller than the house, and I let both phones go to voicemail, and I thought about nothing in particular, which was either a sign of great peace or complete dissociation, and I am still not entirely sure which. Craig called 4 more times that afternoon. Renee called 3. At 4:17, I received a text from Craig that read, "Mom, we need to talk. This is a misunderstanding. Please call me. Misunderstanding. $218,000, a secret LLC, a joint account opened 6 weeks after I signed, a fraudulent attorney, 22 fabricated fees, and the word he reached for was misunderstanding." I showed the text to Patricia the next morning. She read it, set her phone down, and said, "Good. That is exactly what they say when they are scared and they have not talked to a lawyer yet." Do not respond. I did not respond. What I want you to understand about those first 48 hours is how strange the silence felt. These were people who had called me every week for 2 years, reliable, warm, consistent calls. And now, behind that warmth, was the machinery of what they had actually been doing, and knowing that did not make the silence easier. It made it heavier. It made every hour feel like something I had to physically carry from one end of the day to the other. But I carried it. By Thursday, Craig had hired an attorney in Charlotte. By Friday, Renee had hired one in Philadelphia. By the following Monday, both attorneys had contacted Patricia independently with nearly identical opening positions. Their clients acknowledged that certain transfers had been made, but asserted that those transfers were authorized by the trust documents and represented legitimate trustee compensation and estate management expenses. Legitimate trustee compensation. Patricia sent me a summary of both letters. At the bottom of her email, she had typed one line, "They are going to try to make this about the paperwork. We are going to make it about the pattern. Let them file first." Craig's attorney filed a motion to dismiss the civil fraud claim within 10 days, arguing that the trust language granted trustees broad discretionary authority over fund management. It was a reasonable-sounding argument, the kind of argument that works when a judge has not yet seen Gerald's spreadsheets. The judge had Gerald's spreadsheets. Gerald had prepared what Patricia called a forensic financial summary, 41 pages, with every transfer mapped to a date, an account number, a receiving institution, and a cross-reference to the trust language that was supposedly authorizing it. He had highlighted in gray every transaction that the trust documents did not support. There was a lot of gray. He had also, and this is the part that I think broke Craig and Renee's legal strategy completely, prepared a timeline. A simple, clear, single-page timeline showing the sequence of events, the date I signed the trust, the date the joint account was opened, the date the first transfer occurred, the date the first fabricated fee appeared. 6 weeks. The gap between signing and opening that account was 6 weeks. 1 page. Gerald had distilled 2 years of fraud into 1 page. The motion to dismiss was denied. What happened over the next 4 months in that courtroom is not something I am going to walk you through procedurally, because honestly, the procedural details of civil litigation are exactly as tedious as they sound, and I do not want to lose you in scheduling orders and discovery timelines.
What I will tell you is what mattered. What changed things. The first thing that changed things was Warren.
The Pennsylvania State Bar complaint that Patricia had filed moved faster than any of us expected because, and this was the detail that Gerald had flagged and Patricia had pursued, one of Warren's 2 prior complainants had never fully settled. There was a woman in Bucks County, 71 years old, whose trust had been structured in an almost identical way. When her attorney was contacted, she was still willing to talk, more than willing. She had been waiting for someone to call. Warren's bar license was suspended within 3 months of our filing, pending investigation, which meant he could no longer practice, which meant he could no longer advise Craig and Renee, which meant the one person who could have helped them construct a coherent legal defense around the trust language was suddenly publicly unavailable. The second thing that changed things was Renee. Renee called me on a Sunday evening in December, not through her attorney, directly. I answered because Patricia had told me that if either of them called personally, not through counsel, I could speak with them as long as I recorded the call, which Pennsylvania law permits with one-party consent. I recorded it. Renee did not apologize, not at first. She tried to explain. She said that she and Craig had convinced themselves, and I want you to hear this, because it is important. They had convinced themselves that they were simply taking early what they would eventually inherit anyway, that I had more than I needed, that they were struggling and I was sitting on money that was going to come to them in the end regardless, that it was not really stealing if it was already going to be yours. I listened to all of it without interrupting. And then I said, Renee, your father worked for 37 years for that money, and you took it while I was still grieving him, while I was still learning to sleep in a house alone. That is what you did. I need you to say it clearly. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I know. That call, the recording of it, became part of the case file. Patricia used it not as a confession, but as context, as evidence of intent, as proof that this was not a paperwork misunderstanding. It was a decision, a deliberate, sustained 2-year decision. The civil case settled 8 months after the papers were served. I want to be precise about what that means, because settled sounds like a compromise, and in some ways it was, and in some ways it absolutely was not. Craig and Renee, jointly and severally, were ordered to repay $194,000, the portion of the $218,000 that Patricia could prove with direct documentation to the court's satisfaction. The remaining $24,000 was in a category Gerald called probable but not provable beyond the civil threshold, which is the financial equivalent of knowing someone took something and being unable to find the receipt. The trust was dissolved. Full control of my assets was restored to me directly, with a court-appointed fiduciary review for the first year to ensure nothing had been missed. Patricia petitioned for legal fees and won partial recovery, approximately 60% of what I had spent, which Gerald told me was unusually good. Warren's investigation by the State Bar was ongoing at the time of settlement. I have since been told through Patricia that he ultimately surrendered his license rather than face the full disciplinary hearing. He is no longer practicing law in Pennsylvania. Whether he ever practices anywhere again is a question I honestly do not think about very much. He made his choices. The system, slowly and imperfectly, responded. Craig repaid his share through a payment plan over 3 years. He sold the North Carolina LLC, which had minimal assets, and took out a personal loan for the remainder. I know this because Patricia kept me informed, not because Craig told me. Craig has not spoken to me directly since the December phone call that Renee made. Renee and I have spoken twice. Brief conversations. Careful, like walking on ice you are not sure will hold. She did not come to the settlement signing. Her attorney signed on her behalf. I understood that. I did not forgive it easily, but I understood it. My grandchildren, Renee's 2 kids, ages 9 and 12, sent me a card for my birthday in April. It had a drawing of a garden on the front, their handwriting, no note from Renee, just the card. I have it on my refrigerator. Here is what I want to tell you, and I want to tell you this directly because I think it is the most important part of this entire story. I got most of my money back. I did not get my family back. Those are 2 separate outcomes, and I want you to understand that winning, in the legal sense, in the documented, court-ordered, signed and filed sense, does not resolve the grief. It resolves the practical problem. The grief is a different thing entirely, and it does not respond to court orders. What I think about now when I sit in Robert's armchair on a Sunday afternoon with the oak tree filling the window is the question of how it happened. Not who did it. I know who did it. But how? How does a family arrive at a place where the children of a widow look at their mother's grief and see an opening? I think the honest answer is that it happens in the small moments of entitlement that nobody names, in the loans that become gifts without discussion, in the access that becomes expectation without conversation, in the love that teaches people they will always be caught before they fall, and so they stop being careful about the height from which they jump. I taught my children that I would always be there, that I would always fix it, that the net would always appear, and they believed me. Right up until the moment they discovered that the net had a name and a 2-room office on Dairy Street and an aggressively optimistic green shirt. Gerald, for what it is worth, did not charge me anything beyond his standard hourly rate for the audit work. When I tried to give him something extra, a gift card, a bottle of wine, something, he waved it off and said, "Dorothy, I have been doing this work for 28 years. This one I am going to remember. That is payment enough." He retired 8 months after the case closed. His daughter threw him a party. I sent flowers. I am 68 years old. I have most of my money. I have my house. I have the oak tree Robert planted. I have the brown leather armchair and the Tuesday water aerobics class and a refrigerator that still hums in the kitchen where I stood that morning in a stained robe holding a number I could not explain. I have a birthday card from 2 children who do not know the full shape of what their mother did. And I have a question that I carry around with me the way you carry a stone in your pocket, smooth from handling, always there when your hand reaches in. The question is this: if I had been paying closer attention earlier, if I had been less lonely, less willing to hand the wheel to someone else because the road felt too long to drive alone, would any of it have happened? I do not know. I think about my daughter, bright and in debt and quietly desperate, and I think about my son, softer and more lost than I ever let myself see clearly. I think about the version of events where I look at their struggle and do something different, where I have the harder conversation earlier, where I say, "I see that you are struggling, but I cannot solve this for you, and here is why." Maybe it does not change anything. Maybe people who are determined to take will find a way to take regardless of what the person they are taking from does differently, but maybe it does. Maybe the most important lesson in this entire story is not about fraud law or trust documents or the importance of having a Gerald in your corner, though please, if you take nothing else away, take that one. Maybe the lesson is about what happens when love becomes a blank check, when generosity becomes permission, when the people who should protect you understand at some cellular level that you will not protect yourself. Robert would have seen it coming. He had better instincts about people than I did, always had. He would have made a joke about it at first, the way he made jokes about things that worried him, and then he would have gotten very quiet and very still, and then he would have said, "Dorothy, something is not right here." And I would have listened to him. That is the thing I miss the most. Not the help, not the practical presence of another person in the house. I miss having someone who knew me well enough to tell me when I was choosing to be blind. I am learning to be that person for myself. 68 years old and learning. Better late than not at all. If you have stayed with me through all three parts of this story, thank you. Genuinely. Telling this took something out of me and put something back in equal measure, and knowing someone was on the other end of it matters more than I know how to say properly. If this story made you think of someone you love who might be in a version of this situation, an aging parent, a widow, someone who has handed access to people they trust more than they should, please share this. You do not have to say anything. Just send it. Let them find themselves in it if they need to. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, stories about real people, real money, real betrayal, and the slow, unglamorous work of taking your life back, then stay. There are more coming. I am Dorothy. I am 68 years old. I am a widow from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And I am still here.